All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something I know a lot of you have been curious about. The U.S. dollar and all its global power.
It's a big one for sure.
It is. We're digging into a fantastic piece from the Council on Foreign Relations, the dollar, the world's reserve currency.
Great article.
So we're going to unpack how the dollar got to be so mighty, what's in it for America, what's in it for you listening right now, and, of course, the big question, is the dollar's reign in jeopardy?
Yeah, that's what everybody wants to know, right? Is this the end of the dollar?
Well, let's find out. Let's kick things off with a little history lesson. The dollar's dominance. This isn't exactly a brand new thing, is it?
Not at all. It's fascinating, actually. Some economists argue that the dollar was already a major force by the 1920s, but officially, its moment in the spotlight, its real coronation, it came after World War II with the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Bretton Woods. Now, that name rings a bell, but remind me, what was the whole deal with that?
Well, picture this. The world's just recovering from this massive war, right? And before that, you had the chaos of the 1930s, those crazy currency wars.
Yeah, I've heard about those. Money losing its value like it was going out of style.
Exactly. It was a mess. Imagine trying to, I don't know, import something for your business or even just plan a vacation when exchange rates are all over the place. So Bretton Woods was this big attempt to create some stability in the system.
Makes sense. Get everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And the U.S., well, they had this strong economy, so they became the anchor. The dollar got pegged to gold, and then other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. Boom, a system of fixed exchange rates is born.
So it's like Bretton Woods was the official crowning ceremony, making the dollar the world's reserve currency.
You could say that. It was a big deal.
It was. But hold on, didn't that whole system crumble in the 1970s? Did that change things?
It did, but here's the interesting part. Even without Bretton Woods, the dollar stayed on top.
Really? So the dollar kept its crown even when the rules of the game changed. We're going to have to dig into why that is a bit later.
We definitely will. It's a fascinating story.
But first, maybe we should take a step back, because when we say reserve currency, what does that actually mean? It sounds kind of mysterious.
Right, like a secret club or something.
Exactly. So break it down for us. What's the big deal with having reserve currency status?
Okay, imagine you're a country, any country, and you want to trade with other countries.
Which pretty much every country does.
Right, so you need a currency that everyone trusts, a currency everyone's willing to accept. That's where reserve currencies come in. They're like the gold standard of global finance, used for everything from big international transactions to, what central banks hold in their reserves.
Okay, so it's like the trusted go-to currency for the whole world.
Exactly. It's like having that emergency stash of cash, but on a global scale.
Okay, that makes sense. So who decides which currencies get to be in this elite reserve club? Is there like a committee or something?
Well, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, they're the ones who keep tabs on this. They track the composition of global foreign exchange reserves. And as of today, the U.S. dollar, it holds a whopping 59% of those reserves.
Wow, 59%. That's huge.
It is. It's more than double the euro, which comes in second. And this is where it gets interesting. You might be thinking, wait, doesn't China have massive reserves too?
Right. They've got trillions, right?
Yeah.
So does that make their currency, the yuan, a contender?
Good question. It's something we'll definitely get into later, but it highlights a key difference. Just holding a lot of reserves is one thing, but having your currency become the reserve currency, the one everyone relies on, that's a whole different ballgame.
Okay, got it. So, big picture, why should all this matter to, say, someone listening to this right now? I mean, does it really affect the average person? Which currency is calling the shots on the global stage?
It might not seem obvious at first, but trust me, it ripples through your life in ways you might not even realize. Think about interest rates on your loans, or the cost of those imported goods you buy, or how far your dollar goes when you travel. The strength of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency plays a big role in all of that.
Okay, so this isn't just some abstract financial concept. It actually hits home.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about this phrase I hear all the time, exorbitant privilege. Does America really get all these special perks just because of the dollar?
Well, there are definitely some advantages. Think about borrowing costs. Because everybody wants dollars, The U.S. can basically borrow money at lower rates. That gives them a lot more financial wiggle room,
Yeah, it's
right?
like they're getting a discount on their debt just because of the dollar's status.
Exactly. And then there's the whole power of sanctions. Because so much global trade happens in dollars, the U.S. can use that to influence other countries' actions. We've seen this play out recently with Russia after their invasion of Ukraine.
Right, it's like a unique tool that other countries just don't have.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Some people argue that this exorbitant privilege is shrinking, that it's not what it used to be.
That's true. Some economists will point out that other developed countries, they have similar borrowing rates to the U.S. now, so maybe this privilege, it's not as exorbitant as it once was. It's a fascinating debate that's still going on.
It is. It's not as simple as it seems on the surface. Okay, well, speaking of shifting tides, there's this whole de-dollarization buzz going around. All this talk of alternatives to the dollar, does that mean its days are numbered?
It's definitely become a hot topic, particularly after the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. People are looking for alternatives.
Yeah, it seems like every other day there's a new headline about it.
I know, right? It's everywhere. But let's actually look at the contenders. We've got the BRICS nations they're talking about creating a shared currency.
Yeah, that seems to be getting a lot of attention.
It is, but there are some serious internal challenges within that group. It makes a unified BRICS currency pretty unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so maybe not the BRICS, at least not yet. What about the euro? It's the second most used reserve currency, right? So could it be the next big thing?
Well, it faces its own set of hurdles. The Eurozone, they don't really have a unified financial backbone, especially without a common treasury. That makes it less attractive compared to the depth and liquidity of the U.S. Treasury market.
Makes sense. So even though it's used a lot, it's got its own limitations. And we talked about China's massive reserves earlier, but it sounds like the yuan isn't quite ready to take over either.
Not quite. China's been pushing for greater use of the yuan in global trade, but they also have these strict controls on the flow of money in and out of the country.
So they want it to be a global currency, but they also want to keep it on a tight leash.
It seems that way. And that kind of contradicts the whole idea of a truly global, freely convertible currency.
Yeah, that's a bit of a mixed message. All right, well, what about those IMF things, the SDRs? Could those be a contender?
Special drawing rights, yes. It's an interesting concept, but for SDRs to really become a major player, we'd need some huge structural changes. Right now, they're more like an accounting unit within the IMF system. They'd need to function more like a real currency, accepted for everyday transactions with their own debt market.
Okay, so a lot would have to change for that to happen.
Yeah.
And just for fun, let's throw cryptocurrencies into the mix. Some people are convinced they're the future of money.
Oh, crypto. It definitely has its passionate supporters, but that volatility, that's a big problem. A global reserve currency needs stability and predictability, something crypto, at least in its current form, struggles with.
Right, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
So taking all of this into account, it sounds like the dollar might gradually lose some of its shine, but this whole idea of it suddenly collapsing, that seems pretty far-fetched.
I'd agree with that. A sudden collapse seems unlikely. But it does make you wonder, what would a world with multiple major reserve currencies actually look like? What would that mean for global trade, for geopolitics, for just everyday life? It's a fascinating question to think about.
Definitely something to ponder. This is what I love about these deep dives. We're not just skimming the surface, we're getting into the nitty-gritty. But so far, we've mostly focused on the upsides, the benefits, the power of the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any downsides to this whole dollar dominance thing, especially for, the average person?
That's a crucial question, and that's where things get a little bit more complicated.
Oh boy, I knew there had to be a catch.
Well, remember how a strong dollar can make those imported goods cheaper? Well, the flip side is it also makes American-made products more expensive overseas, and that can hurt U.S. industries that depend on selling their goods abroad.
Right, so what's good for consumers might not be so good for American businesses trying to compete globally.
Exactly. It's a trade-off. And in our super interconnected global economy, a strong currency isn't always a win-win. We've seen this play out in manufacturing, for example. A strong dollar can make it harder for U.S. companies to compete on price.
And that could lead to job losses, right?
Mm.
Especially in industries that are already struggling.
Unfortunately, yes, it's a real concern.
Okay, now, another thing we hear a lot about is currency manipulation. How does that fit into this whole picture of dollar dominance?
Currency manipulation is a tricky issue. It's basically when a country deliberately weakens its currency to give itself an advantage in international trade.
So it's like they're trying to game the system.
In a way, yes, they're trying to make their exports cheaper and more attractive on the global market. A prime example is China's actions in the past, where they kept their currency artificially low to make their exports super competitive.
So it's like tilting the playing field in their favor.
You could say that. It makes it tougher for U.S. companies to compete. And what's interesting is that it's not just developing economies that do this. During the pandemic, even some developed economies intervened to weaken their currencies.
Really? Even the big players are getting in on the action.
It happens more than you might think. It just shows how complex and interconnected these financial maneuvers really are.
It really does.
It's a tangled web, isn't it? Makes you wonder what would happen if the dollar's dominance actually did start to fade.
That's a big what if.
Oh.
We talked about how a sudden collapse isn't likely, but what if it's more of a slow fade? What would that mean for the U.S., for the world?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It would have huge implications for the U.S., that's for sure. Imagine a world where they can't borrow as easily or as cheaply as they do now. Think about the impact on everything, funding for infrastructure projects, social programs, everything.
So losing reserve currency status would be kind of like losing superpower status.
There are definitely some parallels there. The dollar's dominance, it's given the U.S. this unique power on the global stage, and we've seen it, right, with sanctions and all that. It goes way beyond just economics. It shapes geopolitics, trade relationships, even military strategies.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. But let's be honest, we've also seen that power used in ways that maybe weren't so great for everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why some countries are actively trying to ditch the dollar, right?
Absolutely. There's this growing feeling out there that the current system, with the dollar at the center, it's just inherently unequal. It gives the U.S. too much power that can be used for good, sure, but also not so good.
Right. It's a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us back to something we touched on earlier, this idea that a less dominant dollar might actually be a positive thing for both the U.S. and the world.
It's a provocative thought, isn't it? Some economists argue that the dollar's dominance has actually encouraged the U.S. to be a bit reckless financially. Think about it. Excessive borrowing, unsustainable trade deficits, all those things.
So a gradual decline of the dollar could actually force the U.S. to get its financial house in order.
Potentially, yeah. It might force a reckoning with the consequences of relying so heavily on the dollar's global clout. And it might also lead to a more balanced global financial system, one where power is more evenly distributed.
Okay, so more balance.
Mm-hmm.
I like the sound of that. It brings us back to this idea of a multi-currency world. What would that actually look like? Would we have, like, several major currencies all competing for dominance?
That's one possibility. Imagine a world where instead of just the dollar, you've got the euro, the yuan, maybe even a basket of other currencies, all playing significant roles. It would make the global financial landscape a lot more complex, that's for sure, but it could also make it more resilient.
Resilient how so?
Think about it. If one currency runs into trouble, the others can help soften the blow. You wouldn't have the single point of failure like we have now with the dollar.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it also make things more unpredictable? Would it be harder for businesses to operate, for people to plan for the future, if there's no clear top dog in the currency world?
There would definitely be an adjustment period, no doubt about it. It wouldn't happen overnight. But in the long run, a multi-currency world could lead to more stability, more equity. It's all about finding that balance.
Balance seems to be the key word here. So let's say this happens. The dollar's dominance declines, and we move towards this multi-currency world. What values would shape that new global financial order? What are the guiding principles?
Now, that's a crucial question, one we should all be thinking about. Will it be a system based on cooperation, on shared prosperity, or will it just end up replicating the power dynamics of the old system, just with different players at the top? It's something we need to be having conversations about. It's important.
It's a lot to process, but I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about some abstract financial system here. These changes, they have real-world consequences for people, for businesses, for entire countries.
Absolutely. The future of global finance, it's not just about numbers and currencies. It's about the kind of world we want to create.
Well said. This deep dive has really been quite a journey. From the origins of the dollar's rise to power, to this possibility of a multi-currency future, all while trying to wrap our heads around exorbitant privilege. It's been a lot.
It has been quite the exploration, and it reminds us that even the most complicated global systems, at the end of the day, they're shaped by human decisions, by human actions.
And that's a powerful realization, I think. It means we're not just passive bystanders. We have agency, we have voices, and we can contribute to making this global financial order more equitable, more sustainable.
Exactly. It starts with awareness, with understanding how the system works, where the problems are. It's about having informed discussions, questioning assumptions, and advocating for change.
I love that. It's empowering. It's not just about the big players, the governments and institutions. We, the people, we have a role to play too.
We absolutely do. And who knows, maybe someday we'll look back at this conversation and think, hey, that was a turning point. The moment we started to collectively imagine a better future for global finance.
I love that thought. But before we get too carried away with visions of the future, let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. We've talked a lot about the potential for a multi-currency world, but let's not forget, the dollar is still the reigning champ.
It is still the most widely held reserve currency, and the U.S. economy is still a major force.
But as we have been discussing, there are signs things are changing. Other economies are rising, there's this push for de-dollarization, and we can't ignore the potential downsides of dollar dominance. It feels like we might be entering a new era.
I think we are, an era filled with both uncertainty and possibility. And it's up to us to shape what this new financial order will look like, to make sure it's fairer, more stable, and ultimately more beneficial for everyone.
Powerful stuff. This deep dive has really been thought-provoking, but it's also left me with even more questions. Like, what would a truly equitable global financial system actually look like? And how do we get there from here?
Those are the questions we should be asking. Not easy ones to answer, that's for sure, but I think recognizing that the current system isn't set in stone, that's a good place to start. It's a human-made system, and that means we can change it.
It is a lot to think about. It can feel overwhelming, but also empowering, knowing that we're not just stuck with the way things are. We can actually make a difference. You know, throughout this whole deep dive, we've been talking about this exorbitant privilege, its pros and cons. But I'm still wondering, is it ultimately a good thing for America? Or a burden? Or maybe a little bit of both?
It's a tough question. No easy answers here. It really is like a coin with two sides. You can't have one without the other. I mean, on the one hand, there are definitely undeniable advantages. The dollar's dominance has given the U.S. lower borrowing costs, greater financial flexibility, that ability to influence global events through sanctions. Those are real tangible benefits.
Yeah, those are some serious perks. But then, like you said, there's the flip side.
Exactly. We've got to flip that coin over.
Yeah.
And on the other side, we see the potential downsides. We talked about how a strong dollar can make things tough for American companies trying to sell their products overseas, how it can lead to those trade imbalances, and even create resentment from other countries who feel like the system is rigged against them.
Right. It's not all sunshine and roses.
Not at all. And that's where the burden part of the equation comes in. The U.S., they're often in this role of global stabilizer, the one everyone looks to when things get rough, expected to provide liquidity during crises, to shoulder the responsibility that comes with having the world's reserve currency. And let's be honest, that role, it's not always easy. It can be pretty demanding and even thankless sometimes.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to enjoy the benefits while also managing all the downsides and, of course, navigating this world that's constantly changing and evolving.
Exactly. Moving forward, the U.S. has got to be mindful, really mindful of how its actions impact the whole global financial system. They need to think about the long-term consequences of their policies, not just the immediate gains. The dollar might stay on top for a while, but that dominance, it needs to be wielded responsibly with a real understanding of how it affects everyone else.
Well said. This deep dive has been a whirlwind, a real eye-opener. From the early days of the dollar's rise to the potential for this multi-currency future, all while trying to figure out exorbitant privilege. What a journey.
It has been quite the journey. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a great exploration. And it just goes to show, even the most complicated global systems, they all come down to human choices, human actions.
That's so true. And it's empowering, right? We're not just along for the ride. We have a say in things. We can make our voices heard. We can actually help shape this global financial order, make it more equitable, more sustainable.
Couldn't agree more. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thought, something to mull over, something that builds on what we've talked about today.
I'm all ears.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the mechanics of the system, right? Currencies, institutions, power dynamics, all that. But what about the values at the heart of it all? If the dollar's reign does come to an end, what principles should guide us as we create this new global financial order? Should it be about competition or cooperation? Should it prioritize self-interest or shared prosperity? Should it be about extracting value or creating it?
Wow. Those are some big questions. I
Yeah.
think you're right. We often get so caught up in the how that we forget about the why. The future of finance, it's not just about numbers and currencies. It's about what kind of world we want to create, what we value.
Exactly. So, to our listener, I leave you with this challenge. What does a global financial system that reflects our shared values and dreams look like? Keep asking those tough questions. Keep exploring. Keep pushing for a future where finance works for everyone, not just a select few.
Beautifully said. I love that challenge. And on that inspiring note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay engaged.